Okay, so we've been talking for a good week now about the age of exploration. And what I'm going to kind of do with this video is real quickly we're going to go back over and just hit the high points. So the map in front of you, you'll see the main places of interest during this period. You have up in the top corner, you have Spain surrounded by green, Portugal there in the red. You have the Muslim Empire surrounded in blue, India in black, China in red. You have the East Indies. I've pointed out the Strait of Malacca, the Cape of Good Hope, and Cape Boator. I've also labeled for you how the way the Portuguese, who tried to round Africa, had to fight against the currents here in black, going up the African coast, and eventually figured out how to do that and round the Cape into the Indian Ocean marketplace. We've talked about all the reasons this was important, how well established this marketplace was, and what the differences were that the Portuguese did by getting in there. Okay, so some little bit of review. Age of exploration marks the ends of European isolation. Up to that point, Europe had been isolated mostly because of its ongoing war and dispute with the Islamic Empire. They kind of blocked their route to the rest of Eurasia and Africa. It also reflects the Renaissance spirit of inquiry. People were more interested in the world around them. They wanted to know what else was out there. You have this huge demand for goods from the East, and new trade routes are needed to fill that. We've already talked. You had the Muslim control of the trade routes, and the Crusades had caused the Muslims to restrict trade with the West and to make it very, very expensive. Okay. Age was stimulated by Crusades, the cultural diffusion that went on. People brought back all of these things from the East that they thought were wonderful, and they wanted more. Marco Polo's travels had stimulated the idea along the Silk Roads. It's very expensive to move this stuff overland. We've talked about that. And then you had the Italian city-states dominating the trades, along with the Middle East merchants driving up the cost. The feeling was a sea route would be less expensive and quicker, but nobody knew how to get there. Okay, they couldn't figure out how to get south of Africa or around Africa to get there, and they were not comfortable with sailing west to go east. Okay, so some things happen though as a result of cultural diffusion and a lot of other things, and there's a whole lot of new technology that makes sea exploration possible. You have the magnetic compass. I think everybody knows what a compass does. The astrolabe allows you to steer by the sun and the stars, allows for better navigation. They start to figure out latitude lines, how far north and south you are. The ships become larger and more seaworthy. Better maps, better sails. The lateen sail is the most common of these. Gunpowder, and then rudders so you can actually steer your ship better. We've been over all of these things. Trade rivalries begin between European nations, and the first of these is between Spain and Portugal. They are the first to get out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're the first to get out on the oceans and change the whole trade of a way where everybody looks. Okay. Portugal is our first choice, and we've done a fair amount with Portugal. Slightly different in attitude than Spain. They are oriented. Spain was oriented towards the rest of Europe and the Renaissance. Portugal looks to the Atlantic Ocean because, as you remember from the map, they're separated by Spain, who they're not overly friendly with, from the rest of Europe. Portugal carefully planned its explorations. Prince Henry the Navigator, who I have mentioned and we've talked about a little bit before we did the DBQ, he started a school of navigation, and he designed a ship specifically for exploration called the Caravel. It was small, fast, and able to sail tight, what's called tight to the wind, which meant you could sail almost against the wind because it was outfitted with the lateen sail, which allowed for tacking and much more maneuverability. Okay. Prince Henry and the Spanish didn't have the ethnic prejudices of the Spanish. They weren't quite as fired up about religion because they hadn't been fighting the Moors as much. Henry's mother was also English, so he had a little bit wider worldview. He steals the caravel design from the Arabs. His main navigators are Arab, and his map makers are Jewish. His main interest was the coast of Africa. At first, they didn't set out to find a route to India. At first, they were mostly just exploring. The Atlantic coastline was unknown to past Cape Boator, mostly because of those currents we talked about. So he sends ships to explore it, and suddenly the world becomes a much larger place. Okay. Portuguese explorations, we talked about these already a little bit. Bartholomew Diaz sails around the tip of South Africa, Cape of Good Hope in 1488. 9 years later, Vasco da Gama reaches the western coast of India in search of spices, and you can see on the map where the different things are that they were trying to navigate about. And you can see how Diaz, in his original, in the yellow, made it right along the coast. Took him a lot longer. Where da Gama learned from Diaz that you could scoot out into the ocean and get around using the currents more to your advantage. Okay, Spain, slightly different, much more religious motivation, much more ethnic motivation against the Arabs and the Muslims than the Portuguese. Okay, the Spanish had just completed what was known as the Reconquista, the retaking of Spain from the Muslims. They had been fighting for 700 years, and they finally drive the last of the Moors out of southern Spain in 1492. King Ferdinand and Isabella lead the charge. Spain is much more interested in evangelism or spreading Christianity. They wanted to gain wealth because they wanted to control the continent of Europe. They had much more imperialistic designs on the rest of Europe than they did anywhere else. They just wanted money from this trade in spices so that they could fund their continental ambitions. So they wanted the access to the spices. Christopher Columbus, who is actually an Italian, seeks a new route to the Indies. The Portuguese are starting to monopolize the trade, the travel down Africa. So Columbus comes up with this idea that you could sail west to go east. The whole world is round thing. Studies the prevailing winds of how to get there, and eventually finds the New World, what becomes known as the West Indies. He lands in what is the modern-day Bahamas. He thought he had landed in India, okay? And he goes to his grave thinking he was just so close to China and India, it was just we needed to go a little bit farther. Didn't realize that he had discovered a whole continent that nobody knew was there other than the people that lived there, okay? So kind of a recap of the main voyages. Da Gama, he's the first to reach India. Columbus is the first to sail west to find a new route to India. Magellan, who we haven't talked too much about, we'll get to him in a little while, first to sail around the world. So in addition to opening new trade routes, these voyages lead to much more revised understandings of our natural surroundings, what the world looks like, that there's different people out there, and that there's a whole lot of different crops. We've talked about this in our discussions of the Columbian Exchange. Okay. And this is all becomes known as that the Columbian Exchange is what becomes known as the encounter. Okay, the result of Europeans crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The goal is a more direct route to Asia. They didn't know the continents were there. It results in a new development of new territory, and it makes Europeans rich because there's lots of gold and silver in the Americas, and it finances empire building and further expansion of trade. Europeans encountered Americans for the first time during this period. That's why we call it the encounter. Okay, so that ends today. Forgot the conquistadors. Most of these guys are Spanish. They were all looking to get rich. They thought they were doing God's work by converting the heathen Native Americans. They had superior armaments because there is no iron and then therefore steel available in the Central and South America. They don't work in metal, so obviously their armament is much superior. They easily conquered the natives because of the disease that we will talk about in class. The two most famous of these guys are Cortez, who conquers Mexico and the Aztecs, and Pizarro, who conquers Peru and the Incas. We will talk about each of these in turn. So now, complete the quiz on Google Forms and submit.